Good morning, everyone. So I want to start, if I may, with a brief overview of our story. Helen was diagnosed with metastatic bowel cancer in April 2021. An emergency operation to create a stoma followed, and then from June to November she had chemotherapy. At the end of December, there emerged a real possibility that she might have a liver operation. And exploratory investigations in January were actually quite hopeful. Unfortunately, when she went for the surgery, fresh cancer was found and the operation was aborted. She didn't want more chemotherapy at that point, which only seemed to promise more discomfort for questionable gain. However, in March of that year, she was offered immunotherapy, and for 6 or 7 months that gave her the best quality of life that she'd had since the first diagnosis. However, by October, the effectiveness of that was diminishing. The prognosis at that stage, I think, was potentially surviving through till the following Easter, something like that. In the end, it happened all much more quickly, and she died on December the 27th, 2022. So Helen died at home, which was her very strong wish, and it meant a lot to me that we were able to fulfill that for her. If that had not been possible, then dying in LOROS was certainly the second choice. What she really did not want was to die in hospital, where some of her experiences had not been altogether good. And that was both for herself, but also for her brother, who died from cancer 20 years previously and whom she'd accompanied very much in that final journey. And I think that experience had been part of what had motivated her to become a hospice chaplain, which she fulfilled here at LOROS for 7.5 years. So in thinking about what made her dying at home not just bearable, but also in many ways a good death, it was peaceful, it was gentle, it was shared with family, it was sad but not hopeless. I think it was the fruit of her own faith, but also her experience here at LOROS. And she was not afraid of dying. She'd shared that journey with many others, and so was able to approach death with a very positive and faith perspective. As her chief carer, who carried more anxiety probably about those final days, I was certainly grateful to be infected by her courage and by her confidence. Now, I share some of that, I think, because it highlights for me that what makes death bearable is a whole cluster of factors, some of which are intensely practical and physical, others more social or psychological or spiritual. And I think LOROS seems to get that, and the interdisciplinary approach to end-of-life care is a jewel which I hope will never be lost. That said, I think some of the very practical things are very important in the final days. And obviously high among those is pain relief. Helen's pain began to increase as the effectiveness of the immunotherapy began to diminish. Initially, that was managed through outpatients appointments here in LOROS with Dr. Luke Feathers. But in early December, she came into LOROS as an inpatient for a week to 10 days of symptom management. She was still very much Helen in that time, interacting with staff, many of whom she obviously knew, and when visiting, we'd often go for walks in the grounds here. Because I wasn't really thinking that we were in the last weeks of her life, I imagined that she would return home much more comfortable as drugs were tweaked to find the most effective combination and intensity. And then life would continue much as before, but just with more manageable levels of pain. Shortly before she came home, she had the quantity of drugs were increased significantly. such that once home I was quickly aware that we had moved into a new phase of her condition. She was sleeping more, she was less active, probably less responsive in conversation. And I think I will own to feeling a bit let down at that point and slightly angry. I'd imagined she'd been in here in LOROS, and that would all get sorted out during that time as the right treatment was discerned. I thought it was really just a pain issue. Well, yes, the pain had diminished, but at the cost of losing something of the person that she was. I wondered whether the quantity of drugs was now too much, and voiced this to the consultant. He gently suggested that it might be as much about the progression of the disease rather than just a drug issue. Of course, that actually turned out to be right. But I think it illustrated how important expectation management is, particularly as the disease progresses, and the importance of having opportunities to voice concerns and issues. So it was about 11 days between Helen leaving LOROS and dying at home. And I don't think anyone realised how quickly that was going to happen. Certainly not on the family side. I don't think the medical professionals either had realised that. On the day after her discharge, we were out buying a Christmas tree, and yet within a week, it was her last day of actually not being in bed all day. Looking back, I can see that one of the big issues for me in that time was our changing relationship. We'd been on a 20-month journey together, and we'd shared it at a deep level, talking through the ups and downs of the different stages and facing them jointly. And suddenly that was changing fast, as Helen was less present, and for me the role of carer began to overshadow just being a husband. Sometimes I had to put pressure on her to do things that she didn't really want to do, as simple as maybe getting out of the chair to go up to bed. The reality of loss was beginning to intensify. And looking back, I can see how important it was that change was also sort of recognised by others and handled sensitively. Rightly, healthcare professionals were still dealing directly with Helen, and she still had capacity for that. Although sometimes our perspectives on where things were might not exactly be the same. I sometimes witnessed conversations she had where I watched her rally and talk brightly with whoever it was, and found myself prompting her to say things that I thought she might be overlooking. But for me, I was always grateful when I felt properly included in those conversations. The other significant factor for those final days was that they happened over Christmas. Dr. Luke had generously told us to contact him if we needed to, even though he was now off. But naturally, I was reluctant to do so. However, on Christmas Eve, when it was quite clear that Helen's condition was changing faster than I'd expected, I was wrestling on whether I should get in touch. And I hadn't really resolved that dilemma when I just happened to look at Helen's phone to see that he had texted her to ask how she was. Well, that gave me the opening to reply, and not long later we were able to have a sort of three-way video conversation. Well, Helen, as she usually did, came alive as she spoke to him, and I think though he was experienced enough to discern the real state of play. And having confirmed that she wanted to stay at home, said he put in motion the delivery of a hospital bed so that it could be delivered sometime after Christmas. Well, there certainly didn't seem any urgency from my perspective, but as it turned out, the service was far more efficient than that. Later that day, my son actually just spotted a message on Helen's phone which said that the bed was arriving that afternoon. And sure enough, it wasn't many minutes before they were at the door. It would have been helpful, I think, for me if the text had also included me, because we could have prepared for that. and so I wasn't taken by surprise, because of course that arrival put me into a bit of a spin, because I hadn't been expecting this for several days. Where was it going to go? The main space in the lounge, the main space was in the lounge, but we had children and grandchildren all arriving for Christmas, and it just didn't feel the easiest place to put a hospital bed at that point. And anyway, I wanted to be near, particularly at night, and there wasn't really much space in any of our bedrooms without some major reorganisation. So I asked if they could leave the bed unassembled so we could put it up when needed. Of course, that wasn't allowed. However, I have to say the guys were great, and they saw the spin that I was in. They suggested perhaps that they came back straight after Christmas, and with some relief I agreed to that. I was alone with Helen again that night, and for the first time really struggled to get her upstairs to bed. And by the morning of Christmas Day, it was clear that Helen wasn't well enough to come downstairs, and I decided to ring SPA and to see if there could be any nursing support in the coming days. Well, the conversation took me by surprise. But yesterday you turned down a hospital bed, they said. We cannot send a nurse without that being in place. Well, no one had suggested that that would be an implication of not having the bed. So in the end, we were very much on our own. And that was compounded again on Boxing Day, when we realised that Helen could no longer take any of her medication in tablet form, and it transpired that we should have been furnished with injectable drugs for when this happened. Sourcing those on Boxing Day was not straightforward, and in the end we managed without them. So the combination, I think, of how quickly Helen was dying and the onset of Christmas might make it sound as if this was a very stressful and far from ideal ending. Even more so, actually, when one of our grandchildren then went down with a sickness bug that meant he kept no food or water down from Saturday through to Tuesday. So some of the family were having to address that. However, there was some real positives. Helen was where she wanted to be. She was in her own bed, in her own home, surrounded by her family who hadn't had to be summoned, especially because they were around for Christmas. And once they were there was plenty of nursing support, and it felt a privilege to look after Helen through those final days. Through Christmas Day, grandchildren were able to pop in and open presents, which Helen clearly enjoyed in between times of rest. Boxing Day was quiet and peaceful, and we took turns of being with her. And then on the Tuesday, a nurse turned up and quickly confirmed that she did not have long to live. She died at lunchtime, surrounded by me and the children. It was peaceful, moving, and above all, how she would have wanted to go. Later that day, I remembered to cancel the bed. So Helen always had said that death is a natural process and not to be feared, and I think our experience bore that out. And dying at home certainly helped to make that a reality. That doesn't mean it was easy, and I've mentioned some of the glitches, and we didn't have any professional help in the home until a few hours before the end. Well, that could have been distressing in other circumstances. For us, it was okay, and contributed to an intimate and peaceful family ending. I guess we were fortunate that the one dying had been on that journey with others many times before. For many, maybe it is a much more unknown and frightening journey, and certainly I was not without my concerns. But I'm sure a big part of what enabled me to cope was having access, even on the end of a phone, to a wider experience of those familiar with that journey, medically, practically, emotionally, spiritually, to tap into, or just at least know it was there. So in the end, I believe Helen's was a good death, and I'm very grateful to those who helped make that possible. So finally, how do I summarize perhaps the key factors on what makes it bearable? What makes it bearable, I think, is a holistic combination of spiritual, psychological, social, and physical factors. Close relationships are changing in those final days, and it's really helpful if healthcare professionals handle that sensitively, including carer as well as patient. Dying at home has the potential to be a natural, intimate and good experience, especially if partners and family have good access to backup, enabling support. And finally, particular times and seasons may make that support more challenging.